Oh, sorry, I was going to comment on measurement rather than social media. Is that
You're permitted.
permissible?
Yes.
Okay. I So we created an internal dashboard just for reporters, so not business focused impact, but just for the editorial impact. And we created that organically out of our own desire to know what we had done in the past week, month, year. But an interesting development as we've been building this, it's taken us longer than we thought, partially because there was a gap emerging between the goals that we were setting internally for our reporters and the goals that we were imagining that maybe funders would like to know about, and the goals that are just more external and to do with sort of imaginary ideas about what impact means. And so I think that's just an interesting anecdote to throw out, is that trying to fill that gap. So I think a lot of the difference has to do with adding in a look at the practices that are most likely to lead to results, because the acknowledgement that we will never really be able to measure this perfectly. I think we have to start there and then say, okay, well, if we can look at what are the highly likely practices that will highly likely lead to the following outputs or outcomes, then those are the things that newsrooms can actually restructure themselves around and reporters can really think about, much more than something very abstract like a year out, if that makes sense.
Dan, did you want to say something, or do you just have your...
No. Yeah, well, one was, as long as Emily and others have made a point about the measurement work. So one is to at least note, for those of you who don't know, that Knight and Gates have funded the Annenberg School at USC to launch the Media Impact Project, with a specific goal of better defining engagement, ways of measuring engagement, and better understanding when does that engagement actually lead to the kind of outcomes that funders talk about, which is raising awareness often, building knowledge, measuring attitudes, perceptions, and even behavior change. And so really getting a better understanding of when does engagement, as you define them. And we had an initial meeting even that the New York Times came to, and NPR, and The Guardian, and Participant, and they even already started to come up with kind of 5 buckets of engagement. And so hopefully that'll all, as we start talking about it, just keep an eye out for that, because I think that'll be helpful in the end, because really a lot of this has to do with, what funders really care about, as an overgeneralization, is back to what Elizabeth said, is the outcomes that we're talking about. And how do we get a better understanding of how do we get to those outcomes? I mean, to some extent, take Steve, your point about the business model, but the business model also as it relates to what are the goals or the outcomes that you're trying to get to. And our hope is, that funders get good at articulating that, the media organization can agree that those are mutually desired outcomes that we should figure out how to measure. The last thing I'd say is that part of the Media Impact Project work too is also building a kind of technical assistance team that would then work with media organizations to specifically help them on their own metrics as a separate little bucket of money and support that would allow organizations to kind of get teams of people to come in and kind of do a look at what are the metrics that you're currently getting. Depending on the outcomes, are you taking in the right information, or are you, as the point made, it's, is unique actually makes sense for what your goals are? Probably not, and so trying to figure out ways that what we want to do is better support media organizations to be able to do it, because it's not helpful to say you need metrics, but we all don't help you figure out what are the right ones to get.
Dick?
We started, I thought, earlier by saying that we thought that our businesses were very different from each other, and I think there's a lot of truth to that. Different markets, different missions, different kinds of journalism. And then somehow we got around to what I thought was almost an emerging consensus, that we wanted the foundations to tell us what the agreed upon set of metrics are. These two things do not connect, right? So I just want to spot that for people. I thought what Steve Waldman said about business models is critical. You need to know what yours is. There is not one. You need to know what yours is. And then the last point is, I believe, the more I think about this, the more strongly I believe that transparency is critical to this. Accountability is very difficult in the nonprofit world. When we talk about running these places as businesses, for-profit businesses, it's easy, right? There's top-line growth at the beginning and bottom-line growth ever after, and there you are. Nonprofit's much more difficult. And one of the things is I think it's difficult for us. And I think transparency, if you are willing to decide what you think is important and then to tell the whole world quite publicly and on a regular schedule how you're doing on it, by human nature, you will drive to that. Now, you may have the wrong direction. Maybe you're not going to the right place. Then you're going to lose. But if you are going to the right place and you are posting how far and how fast you're getting there, it's going to help a lot.
Yeah. Chuck Lewis, you've been sitting there very quietly and taking great notes, and I can see it sort of all coming together on the page. And I think the time has come for you to share the synthesis with us.
I know that's a pretty tall order there. Well, I'll just follow off what I've just heard here. I do think, and have recently written, and we've talked to a few folks here, I do think that the grantees, these various organizations, do need to have a sense of shared values about the so-called metrics. I do think there is a sense initially that most of the interest in this was frankly from the foundations, and there is a reminiscence here of what happened to all other forms of commercial media with metrics over the last 10 or 20 years, with story counts and head counts and folks hidden for the door. And so I think INN, the Investigative News Network, with its 86 member organizations, as an example, and we've talked, should take, there's a couple groups inside INN, the Wisconsin Center for Investigative Journalism that Andy runs, and I think Investigate West. I think there's been some conversations of actually finding some sort of common ground to what the journalists in the trenches think is relevant. That doesn't mean that all the things that we're hearing are not valuable and very extremely useful, including some of the studies that are going on now. I'm not saying that we shouldn't have those studies, but I think this is a new space. Let's just be really blunt. Political scientists studied participation for half a century, and it's gotten so much better. And I think there needs to be a little bit of humility here about this. And I'm an old-fashioned guy to some extent. I think it would be wonderful if foundations could also occasionally support, the journalism.
Yeah.
The actual content. I happen to think that's really important. We just lost 30% of all reporters in America since 2000, and it's wonderful that we're getting better and better with all the metrics, but it would be great if reporting takes time and it costs money. The commercial realm in many ways can't do it anymore, and in many ways was not doing that much investigative reporting even in the last 10 or 20 years. Let's just be direct. And so I think we have an issue here also qualitatively about the best reporting that's out there. And I think foundations do support other sectors, and they've been doing it for a century, and I think they're going to continue, and I think it's necessary to continue this kind of work. And watchdog accountability way. I've been in this space 24 years, and the most interest in metrics has been in the last couple of years.
Well, no, it is kind of interesting. We
Yeah.
did start out this session talking about great journalism, and somehow we drifted into metrics, which, as you
Right.
point out, was not, for most journalists, a completely foreign topic. I mean, I spent decades of my career in news meetings with editors who said, our readers like this, and our readers don't like that, and our readers want more of this, and they want less of that. And the truth is, they didn't have a clue. They had nothing, didn't have a shred of evidence what our readers liked and didn't like. It was just a good thing to say in news meetings. So it is a pretty dramatic change, but it's also a reality, right? I mean, that's what the funders are looking for, and the metrics do exist, so it's hard to ignore them. Mark, we haven't heard from you.
You have not. I'm sorry. I've been listening. So just one thing to bring into all this. All the talk so far about metrics has been about eyeballs and what social media is bringing to the site. I think a key way you have to measure a lot of this for what we're doing isn't just about who looks at your site, but what happens because of what you do, right? And that's something that we've been having to work at a lot at IRE, is how do we measure the impact of what we're doing? It's in what happens because with the content based on the training that we do. So I think as you're looking at how you measure the impact of what you're doing, it can't simply be how many eyeballs are coming to the site, because that doesn't necessarily mean, we all know that. You can put stuff on your site that will generate a lot of traffic. It doesn't mean anything. Even unique, non-unique, it doesn't make any difference. So I think part of what has to go into the mix is looking for ways to measure what actual impact the work has for those people who read it, or for the sort of, and how it sort of plays into the mission of what you're supposed to be doing in the first place, And we're not really talking too much about content today, but I think it's also worth thinking about that there are ways, especially we deal mostly with the investigative side of this, but the way you do your work, the way you do your projects, or the way you do your investigative work can also lead directly to the number of the kind of traffic that you get, the kind of impact you can have. I mean, there's ways you can structure the actual journalism that can change significantly the kinds of impact you have and the ways that you can measure that. And so I think that's just at some point probably part of the discussion.
Can you just go a little further with that? Specifically, what sorts of things are you talking about?
Well, just one simple example is that there are different ways to do, and so we work with for-profit, legacy, whatever you want to call it, media and nonprofit, and everyone's dealing with a lot of the same issues, but so the traditional method of doing an investigative project is to work, gestate, give birth to this big thing when it comes out, and then go take a nap, right? And so that's fine, but what you're seeing more and more of, and partly out of the same necessity, is sort of the rolling investigation kind of thing. The idea that you break this into, the work's not less important, and you don't do less. The impact isn't different in the end, but you're breaking this into pieces as you go along, and there's a sustained, constant hit. And we talk about doing that. And you
build audience by doing that.
Right, exactly. I mean, it's like, anybody, and just from forgetting about the business part of it, right? When we go and talk about this and we're talking to news organizations, it's anybody can withstand one hit if you've done something wrong, right? If there's one big hit and it disappears, the odds of having any impact are very slim. But if you beat that drum continually, and if it comes out in pieces and you keep it going for a while, you see all sorts of impact happen that might not have happened otherwise. But that can also play into the way you bring traffic to your site, into the way people respond to it, and the kind of audience that you build. So I just think that the way you think about doing your content has to factor into this whole discussion, not simply how you get word out about it once you've done it.
Anybody want to respond to that? To that point in particular, the campaign, the repeated hit, Emily?
No, I mean, that's absolutely said much better than I could say, but that's why we teach it in reporting classes, because it is absolutely tied to the format, the way that you report something out, and that is tied to the platforms and social behaviour of people in the wider world. It is tied to the fact that continual partial attention is now completely different for publishers than the kind of packaged media world where you'd send something out and you knew that you had a very predictable kind of reception and response to it. And when you look at the work that ProPublica does in this, it's had a great story out today, but just as important is the format of that, and that sort of we were talking about this earlier and saying this is about process. This is about understanding process.
It's not once and done.
No, it's not once and done, and it's kind of and it's about understanding the entire life cycle of that, and understanding how the reporter and the editing and the presentation fits into that. But where that gets us to on impact metrics, I'm not quite sure. I think it gets us to a point where we're actually as a kind of a professional craft, we understand just much more about what we're trying to do, who's reading us, how we can make them understand or read a bit more in an intelligent way rather than a way that's necessarily dictated by a different business model, which is, the pure kind of advertising or subscription business model. And that's the big thing for not-for-profits, which is, the measurement of impact is inevitably going to be different.
Brian.
The metric I'm worried about right now is our fall fund drive, right? So we're going to be doing fundraising. And going back to social media, we did an experiment. We matched home addresses to as many of our Facebook followers as possible. And we sent them a targeted annual fund drive campaign letter with an envelope. And very few of those came back. So what we found was that that audience, while it's 14% of the traffic driver to our site, it's not a rich resource as far as our fund drive goes. So the people that send us money are those that get our weekly emails. So that list is about 11,000.
But where do they come from?
Well, we recruit them over time, build up that list. But those are people getting a weekly dose and they're clicking through. And those are our annual givers, so giving under $1,000. But that is a much better channel for us to try to raise money.
Margaret.
We tried a quick experiment a couple weeks ago in different kinds of coverage related to a veto session of the legislature. And instead of just doing the standard preview story, we broke it down in a lot of different ways: cast of characters, veto session 101, scorecard, live tweet stream. And some of these we thought might be more shareable on Facebook, and some of them worked better on Twitter, and some of them worked better on the on our website. And so we've and then we can go back and look at who looked at what. But all in all, it created a lot more involvement than simply the standard coverage.
Okay, so let me turn the conversation here just a little bit, because we're going to run out of time very quickly. And this is a pretty unique opportunity to have all these people sitting in one room for even a brief period of time. And I don't know when we're going to get you all together again. So I'd like us to walk out of here with some suggestions on what can come of this that will actually help to get us to the goal we're talking about. I mean, what are the next steps that can grow out of this discussion we've been having for the last couple of hours? And the tags, the name tags all go down. Susan, you have an idea. Yes.
Yeah, I find this discussion very energizing, and I appreciate the chance to hear from so many groups that are so different than Oakland Local in terms of their size or their location. And I think that actually putting some resources toward a smaller group that was a best practices task force, that would be fantastic, because there are many people here, like Brian, who I've talked with quite a bit, and some people I never talk with. And some of the ideas here, like John Thornton's equity, I would love to actually pursue that in my own area. So I think kind of looking at maybe doing a follow-up survey, looking at what some of the greatest needs are, and how could you fuel some small working groups that could do some very specific toolkits, so that just the way Knight has funded community toolkits that people actually use, maybe some of us could help create toolkits that this field could use.
Is that a shared view? I mean, in general, among the practitioners here, let's leave the funders out for a second and the thought leaders out for a second. We'll leave Jeff out for a second. And among the practitioners, is there? Do you have a lack of contact with each other, a lack of ability to understand best practices, or do you feel like you're getting all that you need? Steve.
Since Kevin pointed at me, I'll turn this up. No, not to throw roses where they aren't deserved, because they are deserved. INN and Dylan's group Lion has helped us all get together a little bit more. And as I mentioned earlier, just, kind of the little daily thises and that's, and knowing that, somebody else is going through the same thing. Even if I don't comment on their thread, I know that when it comes up the third time, I can call those couple people up. And I can call Andy when I've got a problem that's similar to what he went through. And I hope I don't go through the same problem that Andy went through. But I don't find, I'm not as isolated as I felt 3 years ago when this started off. So,
anything additional you feel you need? I mean, what's your view of what should come out of this discussion today?
Well, one very specific thing that we've kind of touched on a few different places, and like John, I'm also envious of Joel, is that the demographic research of our own audience. I have a chance, I think, with partnership with a local university to do a little bit more audience study, but I hope they have the expertise at it, because I certainly don't. But to be able to say to, both funders and advertisers and just to their fellow readers, here's what our readership looks like.
Kevin.
I spend my whole day thinking about this question, right? I mean, that's kind of what I do for a living. And I don't have all the answers, but I can tell you what I'm being told by members. I mean, at first it was, let's experiment, let's keep the investigative journalism going, let's see what's working out there. But the fact is, people need more working capital. They need money that's tied to business operations, separate from money that's tied to content. There's still a great need to fund content because content does cost, and we have to continue to prove our value. I venture to say, and I've said this many times, if I were to stop 100 people on the street here in Washington, D.C., and ask them whether they know what Open Secrets is, or CPI, or ProPublica, if 1 out of 100 said they would know what they are, I'd be surprised, right? So these are not brands yet. That we're creating content, we're doing good stuff, and I also think that we need time, right? We need time. If there's one conclusion I took away from Michelle and Mayur in the Knight report is that we are seeing, I heard the gentleman mention optimism. We're seeing some great things happen. We're seeing some moving forward. People are optimistic. Our fail rate is less than in the VC world and with most startups. But the push me pull you between foundations wanting to move on and how long it's taking for us to actually find our way is not a small thing. And getting people together, sharing best practices, doing training, we're doing that. It's Knight, it's INN, it's Line, it's all of these things.
You're really asking for patience.
I'm asking for patience, but also, for example, I think it's exciting the grant that Texas Tribune and John Thornton's doing, and some of that stuff too. We need to reward best practices, but we have to also recognize that not everything fits, and we have to take a look at that way. So yes.
Steve.
I want to sort of zoom up back to a bigger perspective, which is to say, the amount of revenue that the groups in the study totaled up at was, I think, $35 million. And from 2006 to 2009, the editorial spending in newsrooms dropped $1.6 billion. So this is the teeniest little drop in the bucket in terms of the large-scale problem. And I want to point it back to issues with the philanthropic world, which is, it always strikes me when we go to conferences like this and we see what the grant makers are, they by and large are grant makers whose fortunes were from robber barons of the 19th century. Standard Oil and Sun Oil and...
Or of the robber barons of the 20th century.
I think, Pew and Knight are I sing Pew and Knight's praises all the time, and not only because my last 2 paychecks came from Pew and Knight.
Pew and Knight, yeah.
And that's great, but when you think about where the support, putting Gates aside for a second, where the support comes from, Carnegie, Ford, Knight, Pew, and yet when you look at, the winners of the new economy, Apple, Google, Verizon, AT&T, which they're just taking those 4 companies, and I'm going to get all Occupy Pew on you, but the amount of money a profit that those 4 made in a quarter is $24 billion. Just 1 quarter, not revenue, but profit from those 4 companies. And all this is by way of saying that if the winners of the new economy put even a tiny bit of their wealth into this as an issue, this whole space would be transformed. With all of the conversation that we've been having about how to get more bang for the buck and how to be more effective is absolutely true. We have to do that. But there's a bigger...
Yeah, and it's worth pointing out, the winners of the new economy were winners of the new economy on other people's content.
Well, that's... Okay, let's look at putting aside whether or not anything. It doesn't matter whether good things or bad things were done. Let's just posit that it was all good stuff, but it still matters that that there are huge entities that are on the sideline for the most part in this debate, who have the ability to have a massive impact.
It's an interesting point. Chris, you wanted to say something about that?
I do. Let me speaking from a funder standpoint. In my view, a couple things. One, we don't say it enough. I think this is all about democracy for me, and it's under sort of the undercurrent here, but it's all about getting people engaged. And in my mind, among other things, from a funder perspective, picking up on what you said, Steve, we as funders that are in media now or supporting media need to help you get other funders involved. And we need to do it by going to other foundations. We need to go, Knight has done an incredibly good job of doing a lot of your funding through community foundations, but what hasn't happened is the upsell. The people that are in community foundations, the donors or the people that are in donor-directed funds, we need to mine them and get them interested, other than just having community foundation use some of its discretionary money, which unfortunately is usually just a pittance relative to the overall community foundation. And we need to mine those databases, if you will, and start to really aggressively pursue them. And I see that as a role. If I told you how much time I spend personally in trying to build collaboratives of funders in not just media, but in education, other areas that we fund, I spend an enormous amount of my time, because I deeply believe that if we have an interest in it and you have something in your guidelines that says you're interested too, I'm going to go talk to you, because I want to understand what in that area you're interested in, and can we collaborate? Because if we pool our money in a similar fashion you're talking about, we can have a much greater impact. So I think that if the thing that we've been starting to talk a little bit about this among funders, we've got to do that, and we've got to do it sooner rather than later, and we've got to do it in a casting as wide a net as possible.
So we're going to do Margaret, Brian, Elizabeth, Vincent, and then Michael's going to wrap us up.
So what the people in this room collectively can do is articulate in a way that is visible nationally why this movement of news organizations is important, why it's important to the future of communities, that it's necessary for various kinds of funders to step up and support it, and what's a realistic expectation at this point for the experiments and organizations that are existing. And all that done in a very visible way would be very helpful to those of us on the ground going out and talking to people.
Brian.
I worked at the W. Alden Jones Foundation for 7 years, so I have a little bit of foundation experience, and I think we were known as a collaborator with other funders, Dodge Foundation, CERDNA, et cetera. Now in this business, running a nonprofit, what I want from funders is somebody to say, we want to be your partner. If I want them to come to us and say, how can we help you innovate? And take that initiative. That would help us a lot. We don't have the time to think about, all of our needs and then put them into a proposal that would pass muster with a lot of the funders. But we're doing good work. We're survivors. We're persistent. I mean, this group right here, I've gotten to know really well. And we're doing amazing work in our communities. But to get a nudge in the right direction, to take our tools and our platform and our training and our expertise, we could be partners with you, but some of the initiative, I think, needs to come from the funders back down to us.
Elizabeth.
That's an awesome point. I just want to repeat something I said earlier, which is connect us to each other, but also connect us to outside resources. So that trip that I made to Birchbox, tech companies like that have already invested in the growth edges that we're working on, I would rather learn from them and have all of us do it together at the same time.
Vincent?
There were $30 million worth of activity represented in this room. And this is a full room, but this is not the only room. And these are not the only media actors, and I think as important as the work is here, there's a lot of nonprofit news happening beyond this cohort. The INN was created at a Pocanico retreat several years back. Just before that, there was another Pocanico retreat that created the Media Consortium. And I can only see one person that's in the Venn diagram that connects those two groups. That's another important cohort of news actors. And I would just say that the encouraging thing is that in a recent set of 3 years, 2009 to 2011, there were close to $3 billion worth of foundation grants. It's not $24 billion worth of profits, but it is, foundation grants registered in billions toward a wide variety of media activities. So the problem is that it's so fragmentary, you don't know each other, and philanthropy tends to be very localized, very parochial. It's happening in regions, in places that aren't necessarily represented in this room, and we can do more to illuminate that.
Michael, you get the final word.
I have more than one. Is that
You
all
get
right?
the final words.
Well, first of all, thanks everyone for a great afternoon, I think. So I'll talk a little bit about things that I overheard, but also add some 2 cents in. I think it's very telling that we charged into this space with our hearts and not our minds. And I mean that we got really excited. We saw a problem, we saw a need, and so we moved into it. Out of that, there was a cascade of issues that have flown because of the fact that we did it in that way. What's interesting to me right now is there's content companies that are doing very well. BuzzFeed is doing very well on content. Upworthy is doing incredibly well, fastest growing media company we've seen on content. Policy Mike is doing well with millennials on politics and public policy content. So it's not necessarily that content doesn't work. But what's interesting, when I often talk to people around BuzzFeed, they say, oh, that's all the silly cat stuff, which is interesting because they said that about Twitter, and when I started the internet, they said about that as well. So those are things to learn from and recognize that it is. So when you think about that, I would say your journalism skills and background are incredibly invaluable. Your operational management experience is worthless. And what I mean by that is the things that you need to carry forward that are important, that are invaluable, are those journalism things. But you really need to get away from what the look and feel was of how you came out of a news organization beforehand. And when you see that, the question I would ask for you is how many versions of the thing that you're doing have you gone through? And I don't mean iterations, I mean versions. And that's important because if you look at companies that do well, they'll go through 10 to 12 versions in 3 to 4 months. That might look radically different than the thing that they've done. And what happens to us, I think, is we're taking news paradigms that we grew up with and applying this. And it's really important to break the cycle of getting addicted to the continuous now, which is we've got this thing up, we're feeding the beast, I can't do anything else. There's a lot of fail whales in Twitter's history, and I don't believe it hurt their IPO, right? So there's moments that what you have to do is be ruthlessly relentless about thinking, what am I doing? What can I stop? Where can I get space to do things? Because it is true that size, there's some issues around scale, but I think it's important to remember that size doesn't matter for momentum. I always remember when I met the guys from Airbnb, and there were 2 guys from RISD and 2 other people, and Airbnb was doing really well with 4 people. It's what they spent their time on and what they stopped doing that allowed them to do that. And so I think that's really important to think about. How many versions have you done? And I just came from the largest nonprofit news organization this morning, which was NPR. And I don't know if you've seen NPR's latest redesign of their site. And I won't go into specific numbers, but let me just tell you that they got rid of a newspaper format site and went mobile. They built thinking at mobile, and their traffic is up tremendously. And without a blip, they actually are having higher traffic than they do when even big news stories happen. And it's a responsive site, but it's a blog-like site. So really, they've changed their version, right? And they went through lots of versions to get there. So really think about how you can do that. There's a lot of talk around that's really important to capture around innovation happening at intersections. We know that's true. Explore other things, engineer collisions with each other, and that's something that Knight can do a better job of, and that we'll try to do a better job of around that. Also, I think the real aspect is if I could launch a T-shirt brand right now, I would call it "Kill My Website," which is what I'm saying is we're really moving past that. You really have to start thinking about what does it feel like to be a distributed brand that people run into, not how can I get people on my site. Social media is its own environment. It rises and falls in different ways to the point it doesn't necessarily mean you're going to get revenue off of that. But what it does mean is there's going to be a moment where people can do micropayments and things like that in social media, and you're going to have a whole other way to do that. And this is why the experimentation becomes incredibly important, and really getting around the future-proofing of what you're doing. One of the things I just read about was around Steve Jobs. He always targeted the next thing 3 years from what was going on right now, which is that moment that you got something and you're like, holy cow, there's not a disk drive in this anymore. And it was super frustrating. But his point was, you're not going to need the disk drive in 3 years. And that's what kept it, always looking at that kept them future-proofed. And I think you have to get into this. The speed of disruption that's going on all the time is so high that it's not just that if we don't do that and if we don't keep up with that, then the content that we're producing that's incredibly valuable, incredibly rich content won't matter because there won't be anyone around to look at it or get impacted by it. I think a couple big pieces that have come from this is really beginning to understand to know thy audience. That's one theme that we hear. That's one of the reasons we started with the Annenberg School. We really have to figure out. I think very accurately staying away from necessarily metrics and all those things, but understanding your audience in whatever way you can and assessing that is super important. Metrics is one way of doing it. Going out and talking to people and showing them a version of something new that you're trying is also a way of talking to your audience. One of my favorite moments, and NPR is doing a very good job around project management around this and iteration. What they're doing is when they have people come in for tours, they take them aside for 20 minutes and show them something they're working on and get their opinion of it. Right? So now that's a big brand, and there's people that do that. But the point is, they saw an opportunity during a tour to get involved with their audience and to understand better what's happening. And that I think you have to be really focused on. And I think there is, and to the point of the last point that Steve was raising around the new robber barons. Bezos buying the Post is an interesting moment of that. From what I understand in conversations I had around people with that, he's kind of buying it like he's doing a crossword puzzle. Like, how do you figure this out, right? Like, that's how he's approaching it, I think, because unfortunately $250 million is a rounding error for Bezos, not unfortunately for him. So there's something between, and I do think there is differences here with everyone around their content and style of what they do, but this notion of there's a lot more to learn in this media environment around being iterative and moving and experimental. And it's not a side product. It's what you see over and over again is these content companies doing really well. That's what they're really focused on. They do that well first, and then they start adding content. And BuzzFeed, I don't know if anyone's seen the memo, it's out, the internal memo around BuzzFeed of what they want to do. And the 6th point of BuzzFeed is we're going to get serious, right? The point is they're shifting. They figured out how to get people to pay attention to what they're doing. They're going to start moving into more and more serious news issues. So at the end, I think there is differences between us, but one thing that is, I think, lock solid in it is that those things of being iterative and experimental are key structures that we're just not seeing and that we need to see. So to that end, Knight is working on a proposal for our board that's going to be basically an RFP type of thing for specific projects and goals from the nonprofit news set. And we'll be moving forward to that, so it'll be something that you apply for specific innovations. And structurally, we don't have it all done yet, and it's going in front to our December board. So if you contact us early, please don't. We'll remember, because we're not done setting it up yet. But we'll be involved with you on figuring out what the needs are and putting a fairly sizable amount of money together so you can apply for specific things. For example, like making a mobile responsive website, things like that. So, or yeah. And that has to go through our board approval process because of the size of it. But I'm just letting you know that what I'm hearing, and we've heard that before, and we're trying to figure out a way to do that to reward that iterative experimental spirit and to help you future-proof. But you have to have the plan to do that. You have to have some idea of demonstrating it and showing that it is a thing. One of the things we point out with the Texas Tribune all the time is that if you break down what their organization in terms of payroll looks like, it's thirds and thirds and thirds. It's a third business dev, a third tech, a third content. And that's the kind of thing you really need to think about. And what can you stop if you don't feel like you can? The beast that you created doesn't necessarily have to be fed every day. You can also raise another beast, right? So really think about what those things are. A super big thank you to Pew for all the hard work, and for Alan, an amazing job. So thank you very much for hosting and being Master of Ceremonies. Again, we really appreciate that. You'll have more communications from us around this process in the next 60 to 90 days. But we really appreciate coming this afternoon, and safe travels, everyone. Thank you.
That's exciting.
Yeah.
That's terrific.
Yeah. That's the way the life is anymore, I think.
And that's sort of, I mean, just within this,
Yeah.
being forced to say, okay, I'm going to innovate. I'm going to do something.
Right.
I want this money.
Right.
I'm going to do this. I'm going to step up to the plate and buy something.
Yeah, and create the bandwidth. It's the thing, but